The biting wind carried a metallic tang across the desolate landscape, a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the newly captured German soldiers. They stood, exhausted and disoriented, awaiting an uncertain fate in the vast, unfamiliar expanse of the American heartland. Battle-hardened and steeped in an ideology that glorified sacrifice and discipline, they braced themselves for the harsh realities of captivity. They had been fed grim warnings of enemy brutality, stories of starvation and relentless labor. Yet, what greeted them was not the expected cruelty, but a bewildering, almost absurd abundance. This was the first disorienting paradox that would unravel years of indoctrination. The conquerors, rather than starving their captives, seemed determined to feed them, and feed them well. Was this a subtle trick, a psychological weapon designed to break their spirit through comfort rather than force? Or was it simply the bizarre reality of a nation they barely understood, a system operating on principles alien to their own? The answer, at first, remained elusive, shrouded in the steam rising from vast metal vats. From the very first meal, a peculiar ritual began. Entering the mess halls, the German prisoners encountered a spectacle that, to them, bordered on the grotesque. Steam rose, indeed, but it revealed an abundance of what seemed like bland, unseasoned fare. Mountains of mashed potatoes, gravy, boiled vegetables, and often some form of meat, all served with a monotonous regularity. A low murmur of German would sweep through the lines, punctuated by snorts of derision and hushed jokes about the pig slop they were being offered. To men accustomed to the precise, often meager rations of wartime Europe, this indiscriminate generosity, this lack of flavor, felt like an insult. But this wasn't the end of the bewilderment. The American guards, accustomed to the sight, offered no judgment, simply scooping out another portion, their faces impassive. They saw hungry men, not symbols of a defeated ideology. This pragmatic, almost indifferent generosity was, in its own way, a profound cultural shock. It wasn't a calculated psychological weapon, but merely the logistical reality of feeding thousands of internees. The why for the Americans was simple. These were prisoners of war, and they were to be fed according to convention. What no one expected was the quiet, relentless repetition of this generosity, day after day, meal after meal. This stark, unadorned fact that the enemy would feed them, and feed them well, without fanfare or moralizing, began to unravel years of indoctrination. The blandness, the abundance, the sheer consistency of the food became a quiet testament to a different kind of power. It spoke of a nation not defined by scarcity and iron will, but by an almost unimaginable material wealth and a detached, functional humanity that was utterly foreign to their experience. The clatter of metal trays, the scrape of forks, the ever-present lingering scent of institutional cooking, these sensory anchors began to etch themselves into the memories of these men, subtly shifting their perceptions. If stories real that turn your expectations upside down intrigue you, subscribe to Warriors of the Homeland to not miss the next twists. With the passing of weeks, the initial mockery began to wane, replaced by a growing, if grudging, acceptance. The routine of the mess halls, once a source of comedic relief, became a cornerstone of their new, bizarre normalcy. Prisoners who had once sneered at the uninspired fare found themselves lining up for second, sometimes third, helpings. The weight of a full stomach, a sensation many had not known for years, became a silent, undeniable argument against everything they had been taught about their adversaries. The strange, almost sterile efficiency of the American camps extended beyond the food, touching every aspect of their confinement. The stark barracks, initially perceived as temporary holding pens, quickly became structured environments. A daily rhythm emerged, punctuated not by the roar of battle, but by the distant clang of an unseen bell marking mealtimes and work details. The air, though dry and often dusty, lacked the acrid scent of gunpowder or the metallic tang of blood they had grown accustomed to. Instead, a pervasive, almost clinical cleanliness permeated the living quarters, a constant reminder of an order they found both unsettling and, in its own way, reassuring. Yet the quiet question persisted. Was this meticulous organization merely a more sophisticated form of control, a gilded cage designed to pacify rather than brutalize? The guards, ever watchful but rarely overtly hostile, moved with a detached professionalism that offered no easy answers. Their expressions, often hidden beneath the brim of their caps, remained unreadable, leaving the prisoners to ponder the true intentions behind their captors' bewildering pragmatism. The loop of the threat remained open, a subtle undercurrent beneath the surface of their new routine. Soon, the daily schedule expanded beyond just meals and roll calls. Many prisoners were offered opportunities for work, often in local agricultural fields or on camp maintenance. The soil beneath their boots, rich and dark, felt vastly different from the scarred earth of European battlefields. This wasn't the forced labor they'd been warned about. Rather, it was work that often paid a small wage, redeemable at a camp commissary for items like tobacco, soap, or even stationery. For men who had known only the austerity of wartime, the concept of earning money within captivity to buy small comforts was another bewildering layer of their new reality. The sheer normalcy of these transactions, the rustle of paper money, the quiet exchange of goods, chipped away at the ingrained image of a ruthless enemy. But still, the question lingered. Why this effort? Why provide these small dignities to men who only weeks ago had been fighting fiercely against them? This persistent why became a silent internal debate among the prisoners, often discussed in hushed tones during the brief, sun-drenched breaks from their labors, the distant hum of American machinery serving as a constant, ambient backdrop. In contrast to the grim expectations of wartime imprisonment, the camps also offered an unexpected intellectual and recreational reprieve. Libraries, stocked with books in both English and German, became quiet sanctuaries. The crisp scent of old paper and ink filled these rooms, a stark contrast to the sterile air of the barracks. Prisoners, many of whom were well-educated, devoured texts on philosophy, literature, and science, subjects long suppressed or distorted by their former regime. Others found solace in organized sports, the thud of a soccer ball on dusty ground echoing through the afternoons. The sight of their comrades, once fierce soldiers, now engaged in a spirited game of football, sweat glistening on their brows under the unfamiliar glare of the American sun, was a powerful, if unspoken challenge to their previous worldview. It was a bizarre tableau. Enemy combatants, well-fed and engaged in leisure, under the watchful but largely permissive eye of their captors. These small, seemingly innocuous details, the shared laughter on a sports field, the quiet concentration in a reading room, accumulated slowly, building a new complex understanding of their situation. Yet, this wasn't an easy transition for everyone. Some remained deeply skeptical, viewing every concession as a subtle form of propaganda, every comfort a calculated manipulation. The memory of home, of families suffering under the relentless Allied bombing, cast a long shadow over even the brightest moments of leisure. The texture of a letter from home, often delayed and censored, was a precious, tangible link to a world that felt increasingly distant and war-torn. A stark reminder of the larger conflict raging outside the camp fences. With the passing of months, a new generation of prisoners arrived, often younger, more disillusioned, having witnessed the unraveling of their homeland firsthand. They brought fresh scars, both physical and psychological, and a renewed sense of bitterness. Their initial reactions to the American camps often mirrored the contempt of the first arrivals, seeing the bland, abundant food and the camp amenities as further proof of American decadence. But even for these newcomers, the quiet, persistent routine began its slow, relentless work. The clatter of metal trays in the mess hall, the bland but filling taste of the food, the sheer predictability of it all, eventually wore down even the most hardened cynics. The contrast between the propaganda they had been fed about American weakness and the palpable, almost overwhelming material abundance they now experienced daily was impossible to ignore. The persistent hum of generators providing electricity, the reliable flow of hot water for showers, these were luxuries many had not known even in peacetime Germany, and certainly not in the final desperate years of the war. Still, the underlying tension never fully dissipated. The question of trick or salvation continued to subtly color their perceptions. Was this simply a fleeting moment of comfort before a harsher reality set in, or was this indeed the true face of their enemy? The answer remained tantalizingly out of reach, a puzzle piece missing from their understanding of the world. The warmth of the sun on their skin during a break from work, the cool water from a tap, the simple act of turning a page in a book. These small, concrete experiences began to speak louder than any ideology. What no one expected was how these seemingly mundane details, repeated day after day, would slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to rewrite the very narrative of their lives. The constant presence of food, the opportunity for recreation, the sheer unadorned fact of their humane treatment started to erode the foundations of their indoctrination. The faint, earthy smell of freshly tilled soil from the nearby fields, carried on the breeze, mingled with the aroma of institutional coffee, creating a unique, almost surreal olfactory landscape that defined their captivity. This accumulating evidence of a different kind of power, one built on efficiency, abundance, and a detached, almost bureaucratic humanity, was far more insidious than any direct confrontation. It wasn't about winning hearts and minds with grand gestures, but about the relentless, quiet demonstration of a system that simply worked. The small, deliberate gestures of their captors, the provision of basic needs and unexpected comforts, began to paint a picture of an adversary far more complex than the caricature they had been taught to despise. The subtle shift from mockery to reliance, from disdain to a quiet, often unacknowledged gratitude, was a testament to the power of sustained normalcy in an abnormal situation. The texture of the rough woolen blankets in their bunks, the predictable crackle of the camp loudspeaker announcing daily schedules, the distant sound of American popular music drifting from the guard barracks, all these sensory anchors solidified their new, bewildering reality. The stage was being set, not for a dramatic confrontation, but for a profound internal reevaluation. The stage was being set, not for a dramatic confrontation, but for a profound internal reevaluation. The ceaseless churn of institutional life, the bland but filling meals, the measured rhythms of work and rest, all combined to create a strange new equilibrium. The initial shock, then the mocking, slowly gave way to an almost automatic participation. What began as a spectacle of derision in the mess halls transformed into a daily ritual of quiet consumption. The scrape of forks against metal trays becoming a familiar, almost comforting symphony. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic event, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the air of the mess hall itself. It was the moment when the low murmurs of German, once laced with disdain for the pig slop, began to carry a different weight. The jokes about the blandness persisted, but they were now tinged with a weary humor, a shared understanding of a bizarre reality. The aroma of boiled potatoes and stew, once an object of contempt, now signaled not just sustenance, but a predictable certainty in an uncertain world. With the passage of many months, a stark, almost unsettling truth began to settle in. It wasn't about the flavor, or the lack thereof. It was about the sheer unyielding presence of it all. The food, though monotonous, was always there. The steam rising from the vats was a constant, a promise fulfilled 3 times a day. This consistency, this unwavering provision of basic human need, chipped away at the deeply ingrained belief that their captors were ruthless, starving enemies. How could a foe so intent on their destruction provide such comfort? The true symbol of this quiet revolution wasn't a grand gesture, but the simple, almost unconscious act of a prisoner, having finished his first helping, stepping back into line. Not because he was starving, not out of desperation, but because the food, bland as it was there, and his body, accustomed to scarcity, now craved the satisfying weight of a full stomach. The clatter of his empty tray against the stack, the quiet shuffle of his boots on the concrete floor as he rejoined the queue for a second portion, this was the new unspoken language of the camps. The American guards still served impassively, their movements practiced and efficient. They rarely spoke, offering no commentary on the growing number of men returning for more. But the prisoners themselves were different. The snorts of derision had largely vanished, replaced by a quiet, almost respectful silence as they awaited their turn. The internal debate, the "is this a trick" loop, began to coil tighter, not with fear, but with a profound, unsettling confusion. The lack of fanfare, the sheer bureaucratic efficiency of it all, was its own form of psychological warfare, entirely unintentional. If this made sense, in the first link, there is the complimentary episode with behind-the-scenes photos and accounts that expand on this turning point. The unspoken question in the mess hall was palpable. If this was a trick, it was a long game, played with an almost inhuman patience. The sheer volume of food, the consistent quality, the absence of any overt propaganda tied to it. These factors slowly dismantled the narrative of a cruel, manipulative enemy. The warmth of the food in their bellies, the physical relief from hunger, became a more compelling argument than any political slogan. The threat, they slowly realized, was not of starvation or torture, but of a far more insidious kind. The erosion of their deepest held convictions through mundane, undeniable reality. The laughter, once sharp with mockery, now softened to a quiet murmur of conversation, often about the simple mechanics of their daily lives, rarely about grand ideologies. The feel of the warm, heavy plate in their hands, the taste of the consistent, if unremarkable, gravy, became anchors in a rapidly shifting internal landscape. The world as they knew it was not being turned upside down by bombs or rhetoric, but by the quiet, relentless offering of a second helping. The possibility that this was simply humanity, detached and practical, began to take root, a truly disorienting realization. This wasn't about winning them over to an ideology. It was about a fundamental, almost biological re-education. The constant availability of food, a stark contrast to the privations of wartime Germany, spoke volumes. It revealed a nation of unimaginable material wealth, a logistical prowess that could feed thousands of former enemies with an almost indifferent ease. The initial expectation of cruelty had been systematically replaced by a reality of abundant, if bland, sustenance. The loop of the threat finally closed here. This was no trick. It was simply how the system worked. But this closure opened another, deeper question. Why? Why this detached generosity from an enemy? And what would this experience, this daily ritual of quiet consumption, leave behind? The lingering scent of institutional cooking, the familiar scrape of forks against metal trays, the simple, satisfying weight of a full stomach. These sensory anchors would etch themselves into the memories of these men, shaping not only their immediate perceptions, but also, subtly, their future. The legacy of these cafeteria lines was just beginning to unfold. The quiet, relentless offering of a second helping had done more than merely fill empty stomachs. It had sown seeds of profound internal change. The men, once prisoners of a rigid ideology, found themselves captives of a new, bewildering reality. The habits formed in the mess halls, the instinctive reaching for a second portion, the subconscious reliance on the predictable abundance would linger long after the war's end, a subtle echo in their muscle memory. Months later, as the war in Europe finally concluded and the arduous process of repatriation began, many of these former prisoners found themselves returning to a Germany utterly ravaged by conflict. The familiar, comforting weight of a full stomach, a sensation they had grown accustomed to in American camps, was a stark contrast to the widespread hunger and devastation they now faced. The lingering scent of institutional cooking, once mocked, became a phantom aroma, an almost painful reminder of a strange, abundant past. The why behind their treatment, the question that had gnawed at them for so long, finally began to reveal its unassuming truth. It wasn't a grand, insidious plot. It was, as the American guards had impassively demonstrated, simply the logistical reality of feeding thousands of internees according to convention. These were prisoners of war, and they were to be fed. This stark, unadorned fact that the enemy would feed them, and feed them well, without fanfare or moralizing, had been, in its own way, a profound cultural shock, far more effective than any propaganda. The consistency of the food, the sheer volume, the detached, almost bureaucratic humanity of their captors had been a quiet testament to a different kind of power, not one built on scarcity and iron will, but on an almost unimaginable material wealth and a functional pragmatism that was utterly foreign to their experience. The persistent hum of generators, the reliable flow of hot water, the bland but filling meals. These were not psychological weapons, but simply the operation of a system built on abundance. This realization, often unspoken, began to unravel years of indoctrination. When they eventually returned to a war-torn Germany, many carried with them not just the trauma of defeat, but a nuanced, complex understanding of their former adversaries. The old narratives of American decadence and weakness crumbled under the weight of first-hand experience, replaced by a grudging respect for a nation capable of such detached yet pervasive generosity. The legacy of these cafeteria lines extended far beyond the war years. It was a subtle, unacknowledged force that helped reshape post-war perceptions, contributing to a gradual, often grudging, respect for American pragmatism and its industrial might. The simple, satisfying weight of a full stomach, provided by the enemy, became a powerful, if quiet, argument against the very ideology that had led them to war. It was a testament to how the most basic human needs could dismantle the most entrenched beliefs. The memory of the mess hall, the scrape of forks against metal trays, the bland but ever-present food, became a symbol. It represented not just sustenance, but a collision of cultures, a redefinition of what an enemy could be. It was the quiet, relentless erosion of ideology, the surprising power of simple sustenance, and the unexpected ways cultures collide, and in doing so, redefine the very meaning of the adversary. Silencio por un instante. For those who wish to dive deeper into the sources and continue exploring this line of stories, access the complete playlist on Warriors of the Homeland and save the dossier in the pinned comment. The experience in the American prisoner of war camps, particularly the daily ritual of the mess hall, left behind a profound and often uncomfortable truth. It wasn't about winning hearts and minds with grand gestures, but about the relentless, quiet demonstration of a system that simply worked, even for those it was fighting against. The initial cold wind of capture, the expectation of brutality, faded against the warmth of a consistently full belly, subtly altering the course of countless individual lives, and in turn, the broader historical narrative. The German POWs came to mock U.S. cafeterias, but they stayed to line up for more, forever changed by the unexpected humanity found in the most mundane of places.